Hi Simmies! This is my first full Blender tutorial where we'll actually be in the program, using it, and showing you lots of different tools, tips, tricks. Specifically, we will be extracting the pink bottle from the full perfume mesh. We'll be modifying the mesh, we'll be editing the UV maps, assigning materials using Cycles Render, and I'll be just covering a ton of basics that I use when I do my meshing. This tutorial goes really slow. I explain everything in detail. So if you'd like, please download the files and you can follow along with me. Let's get started. So I'm working with the file I have uploaded to go along with this tutorial. The one thing I have done is copied in objects from an exported Blender file from Sims 4 Studio. There's a few things I did to get it in here. I'll go over those later after I've covered Sims 4 Studio, but to make things simple for Blender, I've already copied them in here. So you will see we have two objects. I am going to turn on so you can see my keys. And the first thing I like to do is, these are the naming conventions when they're first pulled in. I like to rename them right away just so it's clear as to what each of them are. So this is obviously the perfume tray, so you can see as I'm selecting them with the right mouse button in the 3D view, they're also being highlighted over here. I can also select them over here to highlight them, and the item you have selected is always in orange. If you select multiple items, the most recent selected one will be orange and the other one will be this reddish color. So first we'll rename this one perfume tray. And then this I will show you in a second. This is what's called the drop shadow. And once we put some material on it, you will be able to see better. Most items in Sims have a drop shadow. It essentially simulates a shadow. It's one of a few ways Sims simulates a shadow. So it's kind of hard to see what these are now. So typically, the first thing I will do at this point is, especially if I'm working with a Sims object, is add on a material so I can see what I'm working with better. Over here in the properties panel, now that we have objects in here, we have a lot more options up here. This is the baking panel. So these are essentially like tabs you can scroll through. This will become super absolutely invaluable later, but for this tutorial, I won't be worrying about it. For now, we're gonna go to the material tab. And if you're ever struggling figuring out where these are, if you put your mouse and hover over it for a second, it'll display what it is. I only use a few of these. I really only use the material, and then this is the object data, which you can see is kind of a polygon with the edges and vertices, and baking. And then properties I really only use when I'm getting ready to import, so we won't cover that today. But okay, so typically when I started Sims 4 Studio, export blend files always go in Cycles Blender Render. I always work with Cycles Render. I originally didn't work with Cycles Render, but I promise you it looks really confusing at first, but it is so much easier to use than Blender Render, and you'll see here in a second, you only need to do a few things with it to get what you need for Sims. I got super deep into watching all of these tutorials for photorealism, and you don't need to do that for a few reasons. One, Sims isn't a photorealistic game, and also you're never going to be able to actually see how the object is going to look in game with just Blender. There are different properties in the package file that have huge impacts on it, so I really only use Blender to look at the texture or the diffuse, which is just the color of the object. So I have these files for you if you downloaded the file set I included with this. And what will go here is we're on the material tab, Cycles Render, and we have the perfume tray selected. I am going to create a new material by just clicking the new button. And you can see that it already automatically created these two nodes for us. The diffuse node, which makes sense, diffuse, right color, and then the material output. You don't need to worry about these too much. We really don't even touch them at all. So this material is going to be for the perfume tray, so keeping with good practice, I like to name it perfume tray. And to get a color added to this, there are two ways we can do this. One, we can go down here to texture and image texture. And so all you need to do is just select image texture and move your mouse and it'll pop up this box for you. You can see this is an open file button, so we'll open that up and we will go to get the diffuse. So this is how they're named when you export them from Sims 4 Studio. And you can see nothing's happened yet. And the only thing we need to do to get it to show up is, you can see here there's the color with a yellow node and then color and a yellow node here. All you have to do is select this and drag and connect it. Now you'll see nothing's happened here, and that's because of our viewport. Right now we're on object viewport, so here in the 3D window, there's a bunch of different ways. You might recognize these from my first tutorial, different ways of displaying the same object, and we'll want to go to material. So you can see the image that we had just selected is now showing up. So we have it here, but this is also the image and UV editor panel. So if you go here, you can see the image we just opened shows up here. Again, with good naming practices, I like to rename these because the naming it has is kind of obscure. So when you see I change it here, it also changes here. So one thing you can do, if you click this F button, it basically just saves it. It's not a big deal. Sometimes if you exit out and you weren't using the image, it'll delete it to keep the file size small. So if you hit F, it'll prevent that. Okay, moving on to the drop shadow. Now I typically don't put a material on the drop shadow, but for this case I will, to demonstrate, and I think it's helpful for you all to learn. So previously what we had done is we dropped the image texture and we opened it here, but another method of opening an image is over here in the image panel. You can go to image, open image, and here we will go to the drop shadow atlas. So you can see this is the drop shadow atlas. We'll see in a minute how it relates. We'll just rename this drop shadow. And then over here, instead of clicking open, you can click this and now select the drop shadow and connect. And just hiding the perfume tray for a moment, you can see there is the drop shadow. So now that we have the materials assigned, before we get into extracting the object, I wanted to show how to see the UV map overlaid. So first, we'll look at the perfume bottle. So I just selected it with my right mouse button by clicking on it, and then go into edit mode. So you can do this two ways, either edit mode from this menu, or tab toggles between them. Now you can see here's the UV map, but it's overlaid on the shadow. Even though the shadow map is showing up here, the material is defined here. So no matter what image you're looking at, it's going to be the material that defines how it looks up here. And this is important because here you can see it's overlaid, it makes sense, and there's a few important things over here. A big one is the image size. So you can see this is 128 pixels by 256 pixels, and the UV map is sized for that image specifically. Looking at the drop shadow image, you can see that the UV map is super stretched. So if you're ever trying to recolor an object or you don't want to mess with the UV map, make sure you're sticking with the original image size, at least the aspect ratio. Even if you had this as a 256 by 512, twice the size, as long as the aspect ratio is lined up, then you're good to go. So one really important feature, a really helpful tool I like to use is down here, this button, keep UV and edit mode mesh selection in sync. So if you don't have this selected, if you go over here, you see as soon as I selected something, the UV map went away. If you turn this on, what it'll do is this really cool feature where it'll highlight over here where you are selecting something. Now this is kind of hard to see because I'm in vertices select mode. I can change over here to edge select, and you can see down here, and it works clicking on the UV map here too. It'll keep it in sync between the two. So this is especially helpful for recolor artists, even if you just come into Blender and get this far, just to understand where the object is laid out on the UV map is super helpful. And then also face select. So like I said before, they're made up of polys, which are made up of a face, edge, and vertices. So these are your 3 different selection modes and how to get looking at the UV map overlaid with the texture. So to best demonstrate some of the different features of Blender, what we're going to do is extract the pink perfume bottle. So the first thing we'll want to do is duplicate this object just to make sure if there's any problems we can always go back to the original. So we'll go back into object mode, and what you can do is by having this selected, the perfume tray, and again you can see there's the orange outline, you hit Shift D, and if you move your mouse around it'll move the placement of the object, and if you just hit Escape it'll put it right at the origin. If for some reason, I just undid that, you duplicated it and you moved it, the thing is the origin always sticks with where it was unless you move the origin. And in all of Sim's objects, you always have the origin right at 0, 0, 0. So you can see this object is sitting right on the Z plane where it's 0, and it's centered in both the X and Y direction. So if you accidentally move it, it's not a big deal. There's a few different ways you can get it back to the origin. One is you can just come over here, and this location is actually stating where the origin is. So here I want to go back to 0, 0, 0. Or one thing I really like to do is I use this a lot. You can see the 3D cursor is here. If I click around with the left mouse button, it moves the 3D cursor. And scrolling down here on the navigation pane, you can see as I'm clicking, the values under the 3D cursor are changing. So if I want to move it back to where the original origin was, I can right click on this object and Shift S, cursor to selected. So that'll move the origin, or sorry, the 3D cursor to the origin of the currently selected object. Same with this one. If I select it and then Shift S, cursor to selected, it goes to the origin of this object. This is a tool I use all the time. I used to do some weird ways to estimate where it was, and I'd go into edit mode and actually see where the vertices were and then type it into the 3D cursor, and there's a much better way to do that. So we'll move this back. So cursor to selected, and then with this selected, previously we had typed it in up here, but now if we just do Shift S and now we do selection to cursor, it'll pop it to where the cursor is. So if I have my cursor way out over here and I do Shift S, selection to cursor, it'll move it over there. So if you ever want to align two objects, this is a really good way to do that. So now we have our duplicated object, and you can see it took on the same name as the original one. So what I like to do, again, just keeping with good naming practices because it can get really confusing, is I normally put in original or orig for short, and then you can hide it, but one other thing you can do is turn off this. This makes it so you can't select it. So I'll hide this really quick. And you can, I'm right clicking on this now, and you can see I can't select the object. And that's just nice in case you accidentally select it or don't hide it, but that's a good way to make sure that the original object isn't selected at any point. So at this point we can just hide that guy, and we'll open up the one we want to edit. And you can see now on this one I can select it. Now I can't. And again, now I can select it. So now we have our duplicated object, and to actually extract just this part of the mesh, we'll have to go into edit mode. So we'll come down here and go into edit mode. Now, I had previously showed you how to keep the UV and edit mode in sync, and this is really helpful because sometimes it can be hard to select all the parts. And so what I'll typically do is use the UV map, especially one like this that is pretty well set up, and I'll select the object from here. So what I'm going to do is hit B, which is box select. You could also just come in here, and if you hold down Shift, it'll select all of them if you want to do it manually. I find B is what I use most. And again, here I want to point out I'm in face select mode. So if I was in vertice select mode, you see you have to have them totally highlighted. So I find it's really good when you're doing this method to use face select, because also one thing you can see is here if I face select, you can see I kind of grab a little bit of the bottom part here, but it didn't grab it because it wasn't selecting the face itself. So let's do that again. So even though I'm going a little bit onto this other object, it's not grabbing it. If I had done this with vertice select, again B, so those vertices were in that selection, so it grabs those too. So that's why when I do this method, I like to use face select, because it just prevents you from grabbing other things like that. So we'll go in here and grab the rest of the object, just scrolling in and out with my mouse button. And one thing you can do if you want to start grabbing it intermittently, which is what I do a lot, once you have part of it selected, you can actually hide that part of the mesh using H. So if I did it here, it'll hide there. Just undid that, and then also in the edit view, you can hide it. The reason I like this is because if you forget to grab a part of the face, so I'm just gonna unselect part of the back, and you hide it, you can still see that part of the mesh. We haven't hidden it all. And then up here we have the top, so just hitting B to go and grab all this, and again H will hide it. So this part of the mesh we won't use, so you can do one of two things. You can delete it, or what I like to do at this point, since we see the pink perfume bottle is completely hidden, we can hit A, which will select everything left in the view, and P, and you can separate it by selection, material, loose parts. If you have multiple materials to it assigned over here, it'll split them off by material. Loose parts I hardly ever use. It'll create a ton of objects. So we'll do P selection. So what this has done now is over here you can see there's now another object, the perfume tray 001. So to demonstrate how when something's hidden in edit mode, it's only hidden in edit mode. So if we'll go back to object mode, we can now see here the perfume tray, again, it's highlighted with the orange, is just part of this object. So we can hide it. And then the perfume tray, the rest of the items that we're not using are part of this object. So typically I'll go in here and say, delete or something, so I know I don't need it. And we can hide that. Go back to the perfume, the pink bottle. I'll hit tab, or we can go back into edit mode over here. And you can see it's still hidden. So how to unhide things is Alt H, and that brings it back. Anything you hit, it'll bring back up. So now we have the objects separated. The first thing I will typically do is, you can see the origin point of it is off center. Especially for decor items, I like to make the object be centered when you place it. So what we'll do here now is there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but the way I like to do it is here we'll do edge select, and now I'll start panning around. I've been trying to avoid it because it can be painful to learn, but Control Alt and then moving your mouse moves it horizontally, and then Shift Alt will move it vertically. So this gives you a way to kind of pan around the object and see where it is, and see different points. So here I want the origin of the object to be at the base of it and centered. So I can go here and select all of the bottom edges, and you can see now this is the origin of the point. It's not our 3D cursor. So anytime you select something, it'll show it up here and down here. It'll show the origin of each of the edges, or if you're in a vertice, it'll show the origin of the vertice, and same with a face. And one really important thing to note is right now I'm on local. So local is going off of the origin point, which is at the center here. And then global, which at this point won't be any different, is going off of the world origin, which is always 0, 0, 0. So don't worry about that too much, but try to always be in global. It can be confusing if the local's different. But so going back, we'll select all of these bottom edges because this is where we'll want the object to be centered at. And like before, if you do Shift S, cursor to selected, it'll put the cursor at this origin. Now I was just in edit mode, and going back to object mode, we can see the 3D cursor is where we had just selected it. And so what we'll do now is we'll go to set origin to 3D cursor. So here's a good example to look at the origin or local. So we'll go back into edit mode, and you can see the global is going off of the world origin, and then local is now 0, 0, 0, meaning our selection point, which makes sense, is at the origin because that's where we put it. If we were to go up here, you can now see we are above the origin in the Z direction by 0.167, and off in the Y direction by 0.05. We're not off in the X direction because this is in the center of the object. Whereas if you were to go to a vertice, right, these are centered around the origin. And again, here you can see the global's different. Don't worry about that too much now. Just know that it's best practice to always look in global. So similar to before, now that we have the origin at the center of the perfume bottle, we'll want to move it to the center point. So here we'll just go to location 0, 0, 0. So now we've already taken the perfume bottle, separated it from the rest of the tray. We've moved it to the origin, and there is one last step we should do. Because the perfume bottle was originally on a tray, and for keeping the LODs and poly counts low, if a part of an object is hidden, typically what they'll do is there won't be a face for that part because you don't need it since it's being covered by the tray. In this case, since we've now separated the perfume bottle, it doesn't have a bottom. Technically, you don't need to put a bottom on it because no one will see it, but my viewpoint is you never know how a sim or a player is going to use an object, and so maybe someone will put this up really high and use it as a lamp, or you never know. So if a part could be visible, I always try and fill it in. So what we'll do is we will go back into edit mode now, and we'll actually create our first part of the mesh. There are a few ways you can do it. How I find the best method is if we're trying to fill in a specific part of a mesh, what you can do is, similar to before, we'll select these edges, and also how we duplicated this tray in the beginning. Once we have our edges selected, we can do Shift D. Okay, and so you can see I'm moving this around. So what we've done is we've just made a duplicate of just the edges. Again, I'll typically always hit escape because it'll leave it at the spot we created it. Now, when you have overlapping edges, sometimes it can be hard to grab, to know which one you're grabbing. So because I want to just work with these edges, what I'll do is Control I. That selects everything else but besides what you had selected. And again, we'll just hide this. So now we have our 4 edges. And as I discussed previously, polygons are made up of 3 things: a face, edges, and vertices. So at this point, we just have our edges and vertices. So what I'll do now is go, and actually before I do this, I want to demonstrate something. So right now, each of these edges are separate. So I'm going to move this edge for a moment, hitting the G button, which is move, which makes no sense, but that's what it is. And you can see that it's not connected to any of the other edges. So this has a lot of different impacts on how the object looks in game. We won't get into that just now, but since we're creating a face out of these, what we'll want to do is remove doubles. So what removing doubles is, removing doubles is referring to the vertices. So each of these have 2 vertices, and then because these 2 touch at this point, you can see, and this is what I was talking about with overlapping. They each have their own vertices, but when they're overlapping, it's hard to select both of them. So what we'll do is grab all of these and go down here. This is just the panel that you only get when you're in edit mode. When you're in object mode, it looks a little bit different. So we'll go back into edit mode, and then under tools, remove doubles. So you can see up here, remove 4 vertices. And here I'll go again, just like I moved it before. And now you can see that they're all connected, which in this instance is what we want. So now that I have the 4 edges, they're connected, what you can do, just again holding down Shift and right clicking on these edges. Now that I have them all selected, I can hit the F button, which is face. So what this did is make a face out of these 4 vertices, or sorry, 4 edges. You can see already that it's got a weird color. If we go back, went back to object mode with tab, it doesn't match up with the rest of the mesh. That is because when you create something, instead of importing it, it actually doesn't have a UV map at this point. So we'll go into here, and if you remember when we had everything else open, it would show where it was selected on that object. Here, because it's not unwrapped, it's just a single tiny point, so it's grabbing 1 pixel and stretching it. So what we can do here before we unhide the rest of the mesh is go down to shading, UV map. So here there's UV mapping itself there is a lot that goes into it and a ton of different ways you can do it, the best ways to do it, but in this case, most of it's unwrapped, so let's just see how to unwrap a simple square in this case. So I'll just go and click unwrap, and you can see it made a square. So obviously this is still not correct, so I'm going to unhide the rest of the object, and Because it's on the bottom, especially if you're just extracting part of a mesh, what you can do is use part of the diffuse map already existing. So here I'll select the object, and what we can do now is actually, instead of modifying it in the 3D view, modify it in the UV mesh. So what I'm going to do is I want to scale this down really small. So this feature, actually our hotkey is pretty intuitive. So S is scale. So it'll scale it down. Now if you notice, it's scaling it down by its center point. A way to change that is over here, this guy. So this is the pivot point. So at this point it's saying pivot at the individual origin, which at this point, wherever you select, it'll show you where the individual origin is. So that's fine, but if you ever do need to change where it is, I use 2D cursor a lot. So similar to 3D view, how your 3D cursor is this hashed cursor over here, it's the same on the UV map. And you can also edit it similar to the 3D view over here. So if I wanted to edit this, make the origin at some random spot, and then now go here and scale, you can see the arrow where it's setting the origin to. Because this is on the bottom, I don't really care that much, so I've scaled it to be small. And now I'm going to use this part of the diffuse map because it's dark and it'll match the color, and it'll be a similar pink but darker because it's on the bottom. So what I just hit was G. Again, that's move. It's the same hotkeys for UV and the 3D map. And I'm just kind of eyeballing it here. Again, I'll scale it a little bit smaller. So at this point you see my origin is way over here, which isn't great. So I'm going to go back to individual origins, and now it's scaling at the center point. We'll put that there. All right, so now we can see it's not a perfect blend, but it's darker than the rest of the object, and it's what it would look like underneath. So now we have the bottom covered, and the one last thing we'll want to do, so before, when the perfume bottle was on the tray, it was next to an item that caused it to shadow. So a lot of times items will have a baked on shadow. So we'll go into edit mode, and then you can see here that it's mapped correctly to a part where it's darker. So this isn't necessarily right for how it actually will look because now it's on its own. So what we can do is start to edit the UV map, but we can use other parts of the existing mesh. So since all of the sides should technically look about the same, what I'm going to do here, and actually before I do this, one thing I want to point out that's really cool is if you go over here to the properties panel, this is the object data. It just looks like a triangle, kind of looks like a polygon. If you click this, you'll see two things here, the vertex group. I'll get more into this later. For decor objects, it's always the transform bone, so you shouldn't need to mess with it. But down here you have UV maps. So cast typically has a 0 and 1 mapping. Objects, they always only have 1, but it always gives you 2, so you don't really need to worry about UV1. But what we can do, oh, and this is a good point, because we had changed the bottom on the UV0, right? You can see that here, but not UV1. You see it pops up in the original spot. So if you want to duplicate a map before you make changes, all you have to do is have a certain map selected and hit this plus button. And what it'll do is it'll duplicate the map as is, but make it separate so you can always go back to this. So I'll typically do original. And then one thing you have to be careful of is you need to make sure to go back to UV0 or whatever one you're working on. Because if you make changes in original, like moving this guy, it won't go back to UV0. And you can also see this in the object, right? If I go to original, it has the bottom part on this purple, and then this UV map is different, so they'll show up differently. And this is a really cool feature of Cycles Render that I really like that I was never able to find in Blender Render. So we don't want to keep those changes. Let's go duplicate this. Put original. I just like to always have a backup in case I don't like the changes I made. So again, hiding is super helpful if you want to try and clear things out of your way that are causing clutter. So this bottom part, I don't really need to worry about it. So I can either select it here or here and just H to hide it. Now it'll get rid of it on the UV map. The only guy I really need to mess with is this face over here. So I want to utilize the other parts of this map because they are exactly like what I want. So what we can start to do is, again, G to move this. And you can start to see as I'm moving it along, it changes. Now for precision, there's two things you'll want to do. So G, if you click X after G, it'll just move it in the X direction, even if you bring your mouse anywhere else. And then same if you just hit Y, it'll only move it in that direction. So I like to first kind of eyeball it. So in this case, I just want to move it in the X direction and get it kind of close. So once you have it kind of close, if that's good enough for you, you can do that, but I like to be a perfectionist. So you can see here, it's not exactly lined up. So one of the most useful tools I found is snapping. So what this will do is snap to different parts of the mesh, and you can see it toggles between both the 3D and the UV view. Right now it's on increment, which I hardly ever use. That's part of the grid. What I basically always use is vertex. So I changed that in 3D view, but you need to change it down here too. So now that I have it close, once I hit G, oops, oh, and that's a good point too. I have this on, I'm on face. So because I'm on face, it's snapping the face origin, and I actually want to snap the vertex origin. See, this is, so if you've messed with the origin before, you'll want to change it. So I was on individual origins before, which are, sorry, I was on medium point before. If we do individual origins with vertex select, it won't go to the right place. So you can kind of mess around with these and see. I'll do median point and then hit G, and you can see it kind of moves it to the right spot. Now you can see all the points aren't exactly lined up, so you can also take just point by point and hit G, and you can go and move them exactly to where you want them to be, so they're all perfectly lined up. Alright, so at this point we're in edit mode. I like to go back to object mode and kind of just take a little scan around it. Looks pretty good. One thing is this kind of a deep shadow on the bottom, so we can also go back in here and you can see this bottom edge is what's defining that. So if I were to go into edge select right now and try and move this, you can see it's hard to move and it's snapping. Well, in not all cases we want snapping on, so we can turn that off. And A to deselect everything, and then here I'm going to go into box select. At this point I want to do all of the edges because I don't want to move the whole face. And now G, Y, and I'll just move that up. And you can see in the 3D view it is changing as well, right? So you can go high or low, but we just want to do a little tiny bit. So actually let's do it a little bit more. All right, so now we have our edited UV map. We have the extracted object. Let's go back. Let's unhide the bottom, Alt H, and then go into object mode. All right, this is looking pretty good. So now we basically have the mesh portion of this done, but one thing I want to do before I wrap this up, well, one, like before, we'll go back into edit mode, and we'll want to export this new UV map so we have it just for reference. So export UV layout, and then I'll typically save this as extracted perfume UV edited. Sorry if you can hear my dog, she's moving around. Okay, so we've exported that now, and the very last thing we'll need to do is the drop shadow. Now, when I first started, I always kind of hid the drop shadow, but they really make a big difference into how the object looks. So especially if you are working with a similar shaped object, what you can do is just kind of edit the drop shadow to match the new object. So we'll leave our perfume bottle open or visible so we can edit the UV map accordingly. And the first thing I want to note is that you can see that this is not exactly at the bottom and that it kind of hovers over the bottom. This is what you want. You don't want this to be on the 0, actual z equals 0, because it shows up super weird in game. So this 0.00587 is the height that essentially, I think I've never seen a shadow map that's not at this height. And same goes for things against the wall, except it's in the y direction. But so don't change this to be at z equals 0. Now, one of the last super helpful tips I can share with you is right now we're in a certain view where it's giving us a perspective view. And we'll change this for the moment to orthogonal. So if you go and click here, this just changes between the two views. But we'll want to be in orthogonal. And what that allows us to do is, with that selected, we can go to viewpoint top. And so this gives us a straight on view, which will be super helpful for what we're about to do. You can see if we're in perspective, it's kind of off a little bit and you get a distorted view, so just toggle between it if you're not sure which one you're in. So what we'll want to do is bring these edges in. You could technically scale this, so what I'm going to do right now is scale, pressing S, in X direction, but you don't really want to do this because you can see that these squares, when I'm scaling them, they get more narrow, and we want to keep the size of them. So what I'll do is go grab these, and then making sure, well, you can have this on if you want. Again, this is snapping to a vertex, so if I hit G, and I can move it in any direction, it'll snap, but we just want to move it in the X direction. So it's snapping to the edge vertex. And then we'll go here. This is B box select, same as in the UV mode. Then G, X. And we'll just go around to all sides. G, Y. G, Y. Okay. So now go and I'll get out of edit mode, and that looks pretty good. I know the shadow looks pretty harsh here, but they are transparent in the game, so it won't be that harsh. So now we have our drop shadow that's edited and our extracted perfume that's edited. So at this point, we'd be ready to essentially put it into a Blender file where we could import it into Sims 4 Studio. And there's a few more things that you need to take into consideration before importing it. So before we do that, we'll go ahead and take a look at the texture and then look into Sims 4 Studio. I hope this first tutorial was helpful. I tried to cover all of the tools and features of Blender that I use. It's a pretty big learning process, but these are just the basics, and especially with doing extraction and recolors, it'll really help you learn the foundation, because just getting a hang of the interface is hard enough on its own. And then once you have that down, then you can start getting into creating objects and things like that. So I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to showing you the next steps. Thank you.